there, deep divers. Ready to jump back in time with us?
Always?
Great! Today we're diving into the Chera and Pandya kingdoms.
Oh, interesting.
Early medieval South India, we're talking like 300 to 1200 CE. While empires were rising in the north,
Yeah.
what was going on down south?
Well, that's what's so cool, right? I mean, these kingdoms, they weren't just like, side characters.
Yeah.
They had these like super unique traditions and intricate social structures. And get this, trade networks that like spanned oceans.
Really? Oceans. That's incredible. So we're going beyond just like names and dates, right?
Totally. We're talking about the cultural and economic like heartbeat of these kingdoms. Think regional literature, totally different from what you might expect. And trade routes just buzzing with activity.
Got it.
And a social structure that basically flipped the power pyramid on its head.
Wow, that's fascinating. All right. To start, let's get oriented.
Yeah.
Where were these kingdoms, like on a map?
Okay, so picture the southern tip of India.
Okay.
That's where you'll find the Cheras and the Pandyas.
Gotcha.
The Cheras, they were like on the western coast, and the Pandyas held sway in the south and east.
Okay.
Now, here's the thing. Their coastal location gave them like a front row seat to all the bustling trade routes
Makes sense.
of the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean.
Right.
So while empires are duking it out up north,
Yeah.
these kingdoms are charting their own course politically and socially.
So while the North was all about emperors and centralized control,
Yeah.
the South was doing things a bit differently.
Way differently. You see, we came across this term in our research, Allodial Lords.
Allodial Lords.
Yeah.
Okay.
These were powerful local chiefs, and they pretty much ran their own show.
Wow. Their own show. Okay, so like powerful local lords.
Yeah.
But how did that work with the kings?
Well, that's where it gets interesting, right?
Yeah.
There was this dynasty called the Shatavahanas. Really powerful, ruled parts of South India before our focus period. Okay.
They had a brilliant strategy. Instead of fighting these local lords,
Yeah.
they brought them in.
Oh, that's smart.
Right.
Yeah.
Made them part of the administration.
So use the existing power structure to your advantage.
Exactly. And the Cheras and Pandyas who came after, they continued this system.
Okay.
So it was a much more decentralized setup than, what you typically see in the North
Right.
with their empires.
Gotcha.
It meant local communities had more say in, how things were run.
Okay, so two different flavors of power brewing in India at the same time.
Exactly.
Fascinating. But how did this decentralized system work with the economy? You mentioned trade routes.
Well, the Cheras and Pandyas, they weren't just trading locally. They were ambitious.
Okay.
They had their eyes on the riches of the Indian Ocean trade network.
Ah, I see.
Imagine spices, silks, precious metals, all flowing through these sea lanes.
Wow. Connecting India to the rest of the world.
Exactly.
So controlling a key choke point like the Straits of Malacca. Oh, yeah. That narrow passage between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra,
Right.
that meant controlling the flow of all these valuable goods.
Between India, China, and Southeast Asia.
Yeah, you got it.
So location, location, location. I bet that kind of strategic importance didn't come without competition, though, right?
Ah, they had some serious rivals. The Srivijaya Empire, based in Sumatra, a major maritime power. Imagine naval battles,
Wow.
shifting alliances, maybe even a little espionage.
It was all part of the game.
It was all part of the game. Later on, the Chola dynasty, another South Indian power,
Okay.
they also joined the race to control these trade routes.
So these South Indian kingdoms were really playing on a global stage.
Oh, yeah.
But were they driven purely by economics? Or was there something more? Did they see themselves as having like a divine mission?
That's a great question. And it reminds us that, for rulers in ancient India, there was often more than one motivation. Economics was a driving force, but the concept of dharma, righteous duty, was also like deeply embedded in their thinking.
Okay.
Kings often saw themselves as upholders of this, righteous order.
So it's possible that these South Indian rulers saw their maritime expeditions as part of their dharma.
It's very possible, expanding their influence,
Right.
spreading their beliefs,
Yeah.
establishing themselves as dominant forces in the region.
Fulfilling a divine purpose.
Exactly.
Okay, so a blend of practical and spiritual motivations.
Right.
It seems like we're getting a picture of these kingdoms that are complex, Multifaceted, not just focused on conquest, but also on trade.
And potentially even a sense of righteousness.
Right.
And that complexity is what makes them so fascinating to study.
They challenge our assumptions about how power worked in early medieval India.
Exactly.
They weren't just like passively inheriting traditions, they were actively shaping their own destinies.
And contributing to a broader, more diverse narrative of Indian history.
So we've got the political and economic landscape sketched out. But I'm really curious about the cultural side of things. What made these kingdoms unique in terms of their art, literature, and overall cultural vibe?
Well, one of the most striking things about these kingdoms is their embrace of the Tamil language.
Okay.
While Sanskrit was dominant in many parts of ancient India, the South was fiercely proud of its linguistic identity.
Right.
Tamil just flourished under the Cheras and Pandyas, and it gave birth to an incredible body of literature.
Okay, so we're talking Tamil literature. What kind of stories?
Well, you have Sangam poetry, named after these gatherings of poets.
Interesting.
They explored themes of love, war, heroism,
Classic themes.
often drawing inspiration from nature and local legends.
Oh, cool.
These poems offer a window into the daily lives, beliefs, and values of people from all walks of life. Kings, warriors, farmers, fishermen.
Wow.
You even had ethical treatises and philosophical works that grappled with questions of morality, governance, and the human condition.
So it sounds like Tamil literature was a reflection of the dynamism and diversity of South Indian society, not just about high-minded philosophy, but also about the everyday experiences of real people.
Exactly.
And what's incredible is that these works weren't just confined to the elite,
Yeah. They were shared and enjoyed by people from all levels of society.
making them a truly unifying force.
Exactly.
So we've got powerful local lords, a decentralized political system, thriving trade networks, and a vibrant literary tradition. It seems like the Chera and Pandya kingdoms were real hotbeds of activity.
Yeah.
But did all this cultural energy find its way into other art forms as well? What about architecture?
Oh, absolutely. The construction of magnificent temples became a hallmark of these kingdoms. These weren't just places of worship, they were architectural marvels, showcasing the artistic skill and religious devotion of the people.
Right.
Take, for example, the Shore Temple at Mahabalipuram, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's carved out of granite, overlooking the Bay of Bengal.
Wow.
This temple is a testament to the architectural genius of the Pallavas, a neighboring kingdom,
Gotcha.
closely linked to the Cheras and Pandyas through alliances and rivalries.
A temple carved from granite?
Right.
That's
Yeah.
taking devotion to a whole other level?
It wasn't just the Pallavas. The Cheras and Pandyas were also patronizing the creation of incredible temples,
Okay.
showcasing their wealth, piety, and a deep appreciation for beauty.
Okay, so we've got this image of the Chera and Pandya kingdoms coming into focus. Decentralized power, global trade, a flourishing literary tradition, and stunning architecture.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, how did these two kingdoms interact with each other? Was it constant warfare, or did they find ways to coexist?
That's a question that gets to the heart of political dynamics in early medieval South India.
No.
While there were definitely periods of conflict and rivalry, as you'd expect with ambitious neighbors,
Yeah.
their interactions were much more nuanced than just constant warfare.
Okay, so not just a simple story of good guys versus bad guys.
Not at all.
Yeah.
They often formed alliances, sometimes through marriage,
Mhm.
to counter common threats or secure trade advantages.
I see.
Their relationship was a constant balancing act. Shifting alliances, strategic partnerships,
Okay.
periods of cooperation, and bursts of conflict.
A political dance, you might say.
You could say that.
2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Yeah,
It seems like they were constantly adapting to the changing political landscape
exactly. And that adaptability was key to their survival.
and their ability to leave such a lasting mark on Indian history.
Exactly.
Well, I feel like we've covered a lot of ground already. The geography, the politics, the economics, even a taste of the cultural landscape. But we're just getting started.
Oh, yeah.
Stay tuned, deep divers. Because in the next part of our deep dive, we'll be taking an even closer look at the cultural contributions of the Chera and Pandya kingdoms. We'll explore some of their most famous works of literature, uncover the secrets of their artistic traditions, and maybe even uncover some unexpected connections to the world beyond India.
Sounds good. It's amazing to think about, these kingdoms, they get overshadowed by the northern empires.
Right.
But they created such a rich and distinct cultural legacy.
Yeah, you're right. It's easy to get caught up in the big political stories,
The wars.
Yeah, exactly.
Things.
But it's those, cultural details
Yeah.
that really bring history to life. Like, we can connect with these people from centuries ago.
Through their stories.
Yeah, through their story.
Their beliefs, their art.
It makes you realize that I don't know, they weren't so different from us after all.
Absolutely. And speaking of stories, one of the most famous works from this period is the Silapatikaram, which translates to the tale of an anklet.
The Tale of an Anklet. That's got my attention. What's it about?
Okay, so it's this epic poem, right?
Okay.
And it tells the tragic story of Kanargi,
Okay.
a woman whose husband, he's wrongly accused of stealing an anklet.
Yeah.
And then he's executed by the king.
Oh, wow.
So she's devastated, obviously.
Yeah.
And furious
Understandably.
about the injustice, right?
Right.
So she sets out on this quest for justice. And get this, she ends up cursing the entire city of Madurai,
Oh, no.
which is then consumed by fire.
Wow. Intense. It's amazing how, like, a simple piece of jewelry,
An anklet.
an anklet, yeah, it can become this, like, symbol of justice, loss,
Yeah.
and the power of unchecked authority. Reminds me of those Greek tragedies where, one little mistake can bring down an entire kingdom.
It's a universal theme, isn't it?
Yeah.
The idea that our choices, even the seemingly small ones,
Right.
can have huge consequences.
And that's what makes those ancient stories so timeless.
Yeah.
And relatable.
Totally. They tap into these like fundamental human experiences.
That we can all connect with.
Yeah, even across centuries.
Yeah, absolutely. But, this theme of justice and ethical dilemmas,
Yeah.
did Tamil literature explore that in other ways, too?
Definitely. You see, these weren't just abstract philosophical debates.
Right.
They were grappling with real-life ethical questions
Okay.
that had a direct impact on their lives. Take the concept of for example. It's a core value in Tamil culture, often translated as virtue or righteousness.
Okay.
And a lot of the literature from this time period explores the challenges of living a virtuous life in a world that isn't always fair or just.
Right.
You know?
So they were thinking about things like personal conduct, duty, how to live a good life.
Exactly. And there were works like the Tirukural, this collection of ethical maxims,
Okay.
almost like a guidebook for living a good and fulfilling life according to Tamil values.
So it covers everything from, like, personal behavior and family
Yeah.
to leadership.
To leadership, even warfare.
It's amazing how these, like, ancient texts can still speak to us today.
Yeah.
It's like the search for meaning, the struggle to do the right thing,
Right.
Those are universal human experiences.
That transcend time and culture.
Absolutely. It's not just what they wrote about,
Yeah.
but how they wrote it.
Oh, yeah.
That's so impressive, too.
Tamil poets, they were masters of language. They used intricate meters, rhyme schemes, wordplay. It was a highly sophisticated literary tradition.
Wow.
They even developed their own unique grammar and poetics,
Okay.
distinct from the Sanskrit traditions that were prevalent in other parts of India.
So it wasn't just about reflecting their culture.
Right.
It was about actively shaping and developing.
Yeah, they were pushing boundaries.
And experimenting with new forms of expression.
Right.
It makes you realize that language is more than just communication.
Right.
It's a powerful tool for building identity.
And creating beauty.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just literature either.
No.
Performing arts like dance and music were also highly developed, right?
Oh, yeah.
Temples would host these elaborate dance dramas
Uh-huh.
where skilled performers would bring stories from mythology and epics to life.
And music was moving into everyday life.
It's like those temples became centers of cultural activity, a place where spirituality and artistic expression came together.
Exactly. And don't forget about the visual arts. Sculptors creating incredible bronze statues of deities.
Right.
Artisans crafting intricate jewelry and metalwork. The South was known for its high-quality textiles.
Okay, so it seems like these kingdoms weren't just economic powerhouses. They were nurturing this, like, vibrant, diverse culture. It really paints a different picture from the typical narrative of a South overshadowed by the North. It's clear that the South was forging its own identity, blending tradition, innovation, and a deep appreciation for the arts.
Exactly. And this cultural dynamism wasn't separate from their economic success.
Right.
Trade brought in new ideas and influences, which in turn fueled further artistic innovation. It was this incredible cycle of creativity and economic growth.
It's like those cities today that are both economic and cultural hubs.
Yeah.
They attract talent, they foster innovation,
Yeah.
and they create this, like, amazing energy.
Precisely. And speaking of the environment, I think that's another area where the Chera and Pandya kingdoms have a unique story to tell.
Oh, you're right. It's easy to forget that history isn't just about human actions, right?
Yeah.
It's also about the environment and how it shapes and is shaped by human societies. So how these kingdoms interact with the natural world around them, what kind of impact did they have?
Well, remember, they were located along the coast,
Right,
with access to both the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean.
right.
This meant that their lives were deeply connected to the sea.
Yeah,
Fishing was a major industry.
makes sense.
And people living in these coastal communities, they developed a profound understanding of the ocean and its rhythms.
Living so close to the ocean, they would have had to adapt to its challenges and learn to, harness its resources. But did this relationship with the sea come with, like, any environmental consequences?
That's a complex question.
Yeah.
On the one hand, relying on those marine resources probably encouraged some degree of sustainability.
Right, they couldn't afford to, like, completely deplete the very things they depended on.
Exactly. But on the other hand, as their population grew and their trade networks expanded, it likely put increasing pressure on those coastal ecosystems.
So that classic dilemma,
Right.
balancing human needs with environmental protection,
Exactly.
something we're still grappling with today.
Oh.
What kind of clues can we find in the archaeological record or their literature that might shed light on their environmental practices?
Well, their temple architecture offers some interesting hints.
Okay.
Many South Indian temples were designed with complex water management systems. They had tanks, reservoirs, channels, all these systems for collecting rainwater and using it for different purposes, like irrigation and ritual cleansing.
So they were incorporating water conservation into their very architecture.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about practicality either. Remember those Sangam poems we talked about?
Uh-huh.
They often celebrate the beauty of the natural world, describing lush forests, fertile fields, the abundance of life in the ocean.
So it suggests a deep respect and appreciation for nature.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see a pattern here.
Right.
It seems like their whole culture was infused with this awareness and appreciation for the natural world.
You're getting it. Nature wasn't just a backdrop. It was an essential part of their culture, their spirituality, their identity. And this respect for nature probably influenced how they interacted with the environment, encouraging them to find a degree of harmony and sustainability.
Okay, so we've got water management systems, poetic celebrations of nature, a cultural ethos that valued the natural world. It definitely paints a picture of a society that was at least somewhat environmentally conscious. But were there any aspects of their lifestyle or economy that might have had a negative impact?
Well, like we mentioned earlier, their growing population and expanding trade networks
Right.
likely put a strain on natural resources.
Right.
Deforestation, for example, was probably an issue as they cleared land for agriculture, settlements, shipbuilding.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And their maritime activities, while crucial to their economy, might have led to overfishing or habitat degradation in some areas.
So, like most human societies, it's a mixed bag. They clearly had this respect for nature and took steps to live in balance with it. But their activities also had some, I guess, unintended consequences.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even societies deeply connected to the natural world can still cause harm if they're not careful.
Right.
It's a valuable lesson, and it reminds us that history can offer insights into how we interact with the environment today. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's dive into a specific part of the Chera and Pandya economies that played a crucial role in their success: guilds.
Guilds, those medieval economic powerhouses.
Yeah.
I remember learning about them in, like, European history, but I didn't realize they were such a big deal in South India, too. Tell me more. What were guilds exactly?
Imagine like a group of skilled artisans or merchants
Yeah.
who band together to protect their interests and regulate their trade. That's essentially what a guild was. They were like professional associations, but with a much wider reach.
Okay.
They set quality standards, controlled prices, offered training and support to their members, and even acted as mediators in disputes.
So they were like a combination of a trade union, a business association, and a social club,
All rolled into one.
all rolled into one. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
They had, like, real economic and social clout.
Oh, yeah.
And their influence went beyond just their own members.
Definitely. They often played a big role in local politics,
Okay.
funding temples, supporting charities, even influencing royal policies.
Wow. Sounds like they were forced to be reckoned with. What kinds of guilds were there? Were they specific to certain trades?
Oh, you name it, they had a guild for it. Weavers, potters, metal workers, carpenters, spice merchants. The diversity of guilds reflected the diversity of the South Indian economy.
Makes sense.
And they often had these elaborate hierarchies within the guilds. Master craftsmen, journeymen, apprentices, all working their way up the ladder. They had their own rules, their own rituals, maybe even secret handshakes.
It's like they were their own little societies within the larger society.
Yeah.
But how did they get along with the kings? Were they completely independent? Or did they have to answer to the rulers?
Now, this is where it gets interesting. Unlike some other places where guilds were heavily controlled by the state,
Right.
guilds in South India, especially under the Shatvahanas and the kingdoms that followed,
Yeah.
enjoyed a surprising amount of autonomy.
Really? That's surprising.
hmm
Why do you think that was the case?
Well, it probably has a lot to do with that decentralized political structure we talked about earlier. Remember those powerful local lords?
Mm-hmm.
They often had their own guilds operating within their territories.
Okay.
And since the kings relied on those lords for support, they couldn't really afford to alienate them
Right.
by, cracking down on their guilds.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's like the guilds were a product of this decentralized system,
Yeah.
thriving in those spaces between royal power and local autonomy.
Exactly. And it highlights the importance of understanding the historical context when we look at these guilds.
Right. They weren't just economic entities.
Right.
They were social, political, even cultural forces that shaped the very fabric of South Indian society.
Exactly.
It's amazing how something like a guild can give us such a deep understanding of how a society worked. It's like we often focus on the big players, the kings, the wars, but sometimes it's those seemingly everyday details, that reveal the most about a culture.
You've hit the nail on the head. History is full of surprises, and it's often those less glamorous details that give us the most profound insights. And speaking of guilds, there's one more aspect I think we should touch on.
Okay.
Their role in passing on knowledge and skills.
Oh, that's interesting. So they were like the universities of their time.
Exactly. Apprenticeships were a core part of guild life. Young people would learn their trade from experienced masters, ensuring that those traditional skills and knowledge were passed down through the generations. It contributed to the continuity and stability of South Indian society.
It reminds me of how important those informal networks of learning are. It's not just about formal education. It's about those like mentor-student relationships, that passing down of wisdom and experience that happens outside the classroom.
Absolutely. And in the context of the Chera and Pandya kingdoms, guilds played a key role in that process, making sure those crucial skills and crafts continued to thrive. But before we move on, there's one more point about guilds I'd like to bring up. We've talked about them as economic and social institutions, but they were also spaces for cultural expression.
Oh, that's fascinating. Tell me more. How did that manifest?
Well, guilds often had their own patron deities,
Okay.
and they would hold festivals and processions in their honor. These weren't just religious observances, they were opportunities for guild members to, showcase their skills in artistry, creating elaborate floats, costumes, performances that added to the richness of South Indian cultural life.
It's like those medieval guilds in Europe that would put on those elaborate mystery plays and processions. It's a reminder of how intertwined religion and culture were in these societies.
Exactly. And it shows us that guilds weren't just about economic self-interest. They were communities with shared values and traditions that found expression in their cultural practices.
It's incredible how these guilds offer such rich insights into the social, economic, even spiritual aspects of life in these kingdoms. We're peeling back the layers of history and discovering new complexities with each layer.
You've got it. And it's that multifaceted nature of guilds that makes them such a fascinating subject for historical study.
Okay, I feel like we've really delved deep into the world of South Indian guilds. But before we move on, I have this one question that's been nagging at me.
Okay, let's hear it. What's on your mind?
Well, we've talked about how these guilds promoted stability, transmitted knowledge, even enriched cultural life. But what happened to them eventually? Did they just fade away, or were there other factors that led to their decline?
That's a question historians are still debating. It's likely a combination of factors contributed to their decline. Some historians believe that the rise of centralized states in later periods played a role.
Right.
As kings consolidated power and wanted more control over the economy, they might have imposed regulations that gradually weakened the guild's autonomy and influence.
It's that age-old tension between centralized power and local autonomy again.
Precisely. And then there's the impact of changing economic conditions. Think about the arrival of European traders in the 16th century. It disrupted traditional trade networks and brought new economic forces into play that guilds might have struggled to adapt to.
So globalization, in a way, contributed to their decline.
It's a possibility.
Yeah.
New trade routes, new commodities, new competition, it all created a much more dynamic and unpredictable economic environment. And then there were social and cultural shifts, the emergence of new religious movements, evolving social structures, changing values. All of these things might have undermined the traditional foundations of guild life.
So it's a complex web of political, economic, and social changes
Yeah.
that ultimately led to their decline. It reminds us that history is rarely about simple cause and effect, right? It's about the convergence of multiple factors,
Yeah.
all influencing each other in complex ways.
Exactly. And it's that complexity that makes history so captivating
Right.
and challenging to study. But it's also what makes it so rewarding, uncovering those connections and understanding how different forces shape the course of human events.
You're right. It's like solving a giant puzzle. Now, we've explored the political landscape, the economic systems, the cultural achievements, the environmental interactions, even those fascinating guilds. I feel like we've covered so much ground. But before we wrap up our deep dive into the Chera and Pandya kingdoms, there's one big question that I just can't shake.
Okay, lay it on me. What's this burning question that's been on your mind?
Well, we've talked about how these kingdoms thrived for centuries, building a rich legacy of art, literature, trade. But why did they eventually decline? What brought about their downfall?
The classic question of the rise and fall of civilizations. It's one that has fascinated historians forever.
Yeah,
And there's rarely a straightforward answer.
right.
It's usually a combination of internal and external factors, often interacting in ways that are hard to predict, that lead to the downfall of even the mightiest kingdoms.
So, no easy answers.
Yeah.
But what are some of the key factors that historians have identified as contributing to the decline of the Chera and Pandya kingdoms?
Well, internal conflict is often a major factor in the decline of any kingdom. Succession disputes, power struggles between rival factions,
Right.
rebellions within the provinces, all of these things can weaken a kingdom from the inside, making it more vulnerable to external threats.
Mhm.
And in the case of the Chera and Pandya kingdoms, we do see evidence of these internal conflicts in their later periods.
It's like that saying, a house divided against itself cannot stand.
Exactly. And then you have the impact of external pressures, the rise of new regional powers, invasions from outside forces,
Right.
shifts in trade patterns. This can all create challenges that a kingdom might not be able to overcome. In the case of the Chera and Pandya kingdoms, they faced pressure from various sources, including the growing power of the Chola dynasty,
Okay.
incursions by the Rashtrakutas from the Deccan, and eventually the arrival of Muslim armies from the north.
So it was this combination of internal weaknesses and external forces that ultimately led to their decline. It reminds us that even the most successful kingdoms aren't immune to the winds of change.
Exactly. And it reminds us that history is this constant process of flux. Empires rise and fall, new powers emerge, the world is constantly changing.
Okay, I'm starting to get a little philosophical here, but before we spiral too far down that rabbit hole, I guess I'm going to start wrapping up our deep dive for today. We've explored the Chera and Pandya kingdoms from every angle: their politics, economics, culture, their relationship with the environment, their reasons for decline. My brain is honestly overflowing with new information.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? And it just
Yeah.
goes to show that there's always more to learn, always more layers to uncover when we delve into history.
Absolutely. But before we completely close the book on the Chera and Pandya kingdoms, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking question.
Ooh, I love a good cliffhanger. Let's hear it.
We've talked about how these kingdoms developed distinct traditions, complex social structures, powerful economic networks, and how they interacted with their neighbors, their environment, even global trade routes. But how did their unique experiences, their particular way of life, contribute to the broader story of India? How did their legacy shape the cultural, economic, and even political landscape of the subcontinent as a whole?
That's a brilliant question.
Yeah,
And it's one that I think deserves further exploration.
right.
History isn't just about isolated events or individual kingdoms. It's about how practices spread and evolve over time.
Exactly. So, to our listeners, I encourage you to ponder that question as you continue your own deep dive into the world of the Chera and Pandya kingdoms. And join us next time as we wrap up our exploration of early medieval South India, uncovering even more hidden gems and connecting the dots to the bigger picture of Indian history. It really makes you wonder, how these kingdoms that are often seen as existing on the periphery of those big northern empires
Yeah.
actually played a role in shaping the India we know today.
Right. It's time to challenge those old
Yeah.
narratives and give the South the recognition it deserves.
Hmm.
And it's not about downplaying the importance of the North,
Right.
but understanding that Indian history is this vibrant tapestry
Yeah.
woven from so many different regional experiences.
I love that. A tapestry of regional experiences is such a perfect way to think about it. It really highlights that India's strength comes from its diversity.
Absolutely.
The blend of cultures, languages, traditions, it's all part of what makes India so unique.
Absolutely. And that's why understanding the contributions of regions like the Chera and Pandya kingdoms is so crucial.
Yeah.
They weren't just isolated entities, they were these vital threads woven into that larger tapestry, adding their own colors and textures to the richness of Indian civilization.
Okay, so let's get specific. Where do we see the influence of these kingdoms in Indian culture, economics, and politics? What are some, concrete examples of their lasting impact?
Let's start with religion. The Chera and Pandya kingdoms were predominantly Hindu, but they had their own unique practices and beliefs. That contributed to the diversity of Hinduism as a whole. For instance, the worship of Murugan, a deity especially popular in South India, was really prominent in these kingdoms. And even today, Murugan temples and festivals are a vibrant part of South Indian religious life. It's a direct link back to the legacy of these ancient kingdoms.
That makes sense. It's like how within Christianity you have different saints and traditions celebrated in different parts of the world. It shows that religion isn't this monolithic thing. It adapts and evolves within different cultural contexts. It's a living tradition.
Exactly. And while we're on the topic of cultural context, let's talk about the Tamil language again. We've touched on its richness and literary impact, but it also had this incredible influence on other languages and cultures. Tamil words and phrases have made their way into other South Indian languages, and even into Sanskrit, adding to the linguistic diversity of the subcontinent.
It's like how English has all these words borrowed from French, Latin, Greek. It's a reminder that languages are always evolving, borrowing from each other, reflecting those dynamic cultural exchanges happening over time.
Precisely. And it goes beyond just language. The artistic traditions of these kingdoms had a far-reaching impact as well. Think about their temple architecture. It influenced temple styles in other parts of South India and even spread to Southeast Asia. Remember how we discussed the Cholas and their impressive maritime expeditions? Well, they didn't just export goods and soldiers, they also carried cultural influences, like architectural styles, which left a mark on the regions they interacted with.
It's fascinating how something as tangible as a temple can become a vehicle for cultural transmission, carrying ideas and aesthetics across oceans and continents.
It really is. And it highlights how culture isn't static, it's constantly on the move, adapting and evolving as it encounters new environments and influences. Now, of course, we can't forget about the economic contributions of the Chera and Pandya kingdoms. They were power players in the Indian Ocean trade network, and their economic activity had ripple effects throughout the region.
You're right. Those bustling trade routes, those exotic spices, those luxurious silks, it all added up to a significant economic force. But how did their economic activities shape the Indian landscape specifically?
Well, for one, they helped solidify South India's position as a major hub for trade and commerce. Their ports, like Mussoories on the Malabar coast, became vital crossroads for international trade, connecting India to the wider world. And this economic vibrancy, in turn, encouraged cultural exchange and technological innovation.
It all goes back to that idea we talked about earlier, the close connection between culture and economics. Trade doesn't just bring wealth, it brings new ideas, new technologies, new ways of thinking about the world.
Exactly, and the Chera and Pandya kingdoms were right there in the thick of it, playing a key role in integrating South India into the global economy. And they went beyond just trading. They also developed sophisticated systems for agriculture, irrigation, and craft production, all of which contributed to the economic prosperity of the region.
It's like a chain reaction. Trade fuels economic growth, which then leads to innovation in agriculture and technology. It shows how interconnected everything is. History isn't just about these isolated events. It's about understanding these larger processes that shape human civilization.
You got it. And in the context of these kingdoms, their economic contributions were a crucial part of the bigger story of India, laying the foundation for the economic dynamism we see in the South today. Now, before we wrap up our deep dive, I think it's important to acknowledge the political legacy of the Chera and Pandya kingdoms as well.
Yes, absolutely. We've talked about their decentralized political structures, the way they incorporated local lords into their administration. But what kind of lasting impact did those systems have on the political landscape of India?
Well, one of the most significant contributions, I think, was the idea of regional identity. Remember how we discussed how the South, with its distinct languages, cultures, and political traditions, developed a sense of identity that was separate from the North? Well, this idea of regionalism, of distinct cultural and political spheres within the larger framework of India, has continued to shape Indian politics even to this day.
That's such an interesting point. It's like how in Europe you have all these different regions with their own languages, cultures, and sometimes even political systems, all coexisting within the broader framework of the European Union. It shows that unity doesn't require uniformity. It can be about embracing diversity, recognizing that strength comes from having different perspectives and experiences.
You summed it up perfectly, and it's a lesson that's relevant to all of us, especially in a world where globalization and technology are constantly pushing us towards greater interconnectedness. It's about finding that balance between global integration and local identity, between universal values and regional traditions.
It's a delicate balancing act, for sure, but one that's essential for creating a more just and equitable world. Well, on that note, I think it's time to bring our deep dive to a close. We've explored the Chera and Pandya kingdoms from every angle, their politics, their economics, their culture, their environment, their rise and fall, and ultimately, their enduring legacies. It feels like we've really done them justice.
We've certainly given them the attention they deserve, and it's been a truly rewarding experience unearthing these hidden gems of South Indian history and understanding their contribution to the broader narrative of India.
I couldn't agree more. So to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery. We hope you've gained a deeper appreciation for the rich tapestry of Indian history and the many threads that contribute to its complexity and beauty.